To be continued.
48-hour art check, round 54. Right, 54.
Boom. Yes, and as we spoke about last time, like we are just speculating when that explosion ends.
Right.
I love the new television you got in your house. It looks really familiar.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought I would stop being in a real environment and just start being inside of my stickers. I think that's kind of where I'm going now.
I think that's brilliant, man. That's brilliant. I'm gonna have to invest. I'm gonna have to invest in a small green screen because it does add like a fun thing, and it reminds me how rad that is as a design. It's just a nice design.
Oh, thanks.
Kind of appropriate for a YouTube.
Yeah, I figure if there was an all-seeing eye, he would be really bored if you watch TV. The other all-seeing eye design I did, he's like crying because I'm pretty sure if you could see everything, you'd just be super depressed all the time.
Oh yeah.
Maybe you'd be excited or happy by the good things that are happening. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like that classic thing of like it'd be great to know everybody's thoughts until you hear everybody's thoughts. And then so all right, should we dive in?
Yeah. Why don't you go first this time?
Sure. I like the plaid. It looks a little NCS-ish. So yeah, I finished the page finally.
Woohoo!
So tomorrow I'm gonna scan and clean it up. But man, I'm glad to be done with that page because it's been taking too long. So I'm glad it's done. And I'm happy with how it came out.
So, it's also going to be one of those pages that people are going to stop and look at it. You know what I mean? They're not going to speed past it. So
yeah,
I think that's cool. And you finished your page, and I started mine. So
yeah,
I've started adding characters. I have 11 characters so far added in, and I'm doing it in the Destruction of the Louvre, which is an old painting that this guy imagined what it would be like if the Louvre was destroyed. And that kind of fits in with what I'm trying to say there. So,
I love it. I'm so excited about it. Okay, so let's see. So challenges. I am exhausted. I mean, I was at work till late, and like I'd say like 75% of my team stuck around. And we were there late, and it's just, as if you guys have been following this, you'll know it's been a while. So
yeah,
just keeping the energy to keep doing the pages is tough.
Yeah, and those are long days. Let's see, challenges. I haven't had a ton of time to do much because we've been getting ready for a home inspection for more adoption stuff. They come and check up on you to make sure that the baby's okay. That happened today. We seemed to do well. Just school stuff, first week of semester and all that. So just not a ton of time.
Yeah, that sounds like emotionally taxing too. Let's see. Plans. My plans are to scan and clean up this page, get it posted online, and then I'd like to get the next thumbnails going. So by the time, this next one comes around, I'd like to have the next page kind of thumbnailed, have a good map, and hopefully it won't take nearly as long.
As far as my plans, I'm going to continue to add characters to this, and it takes a long time because I have to find the right reference, and then I also have to find the right idea, and then I'm trying to place them in there so that they work. But my actual plan is they work in perspective. My actual plan is I think I'm going to get 30 characters in there, and I'm going to do this for Inktober, and I will pencil and ink one character a day for the month of October. So I hope I get the roughs done in the next week, and then I can kind of get some other stuff done. But then I'll start inking this on paper, one character a day. I think that'll be kind of fun.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it, and I think that the way you're approaching that is so great, and it's cool that you're being transparent about it. Because I remember the first time I had to approach like a really big crowd scene in perspective.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to kind of figure out to sort of work the background first, work the characters, kind of get them sized over the background and placed within it.
Right.
And when you approach it that way, it gives you a lot more freedom to kind of, and a little more freedom to kind of have some wiggle room and be able to make things really work. And when you finish executing this, it's going to look so good because of all that groundwork you're building right now. So yeah, it's definitely good you're taking your time on it, because to make sure it all works in perspective and stuff like that. That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But it's cool that you're showing a little behind the curtain on it, because like I said, I think my first few times trying to tackle something like that, I was baffled. And then it's like kind of once you figure it out, it's a lot of work, but it's not as like mystifying,
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't think I've figured it out yet, because this is the first crowd scene I've ever done. But one thing that I saw that was really helpful is I was looking through one of Andrew Loomis's books, and he has just a page, and he talks about hanging figures on the horizon. And it's basically like wherever the horizon hits one figure, if everybody's roughly the same height, it's going to hit all of the other figures in the same spot. And so if my horizon line hits kind of mid-calf, then it's going to hit everybody mid-calf, but they're going to get bigger based in perspective. Samus Aran is much taller than everybody else because of her suit. And so her suit's bigger. And so you kind of vary the height a little bit, but the horizon should hit everybody kind of like mid-calf. That's kind of my rough. I'm not doing too much. I'm not drawing, thousands of little lines going to the center and stuff. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And to be honest, I traced over the architecture just really roughly and then deleted that image. And I'll just draw it in and do all the detail from a bunch of different types of reference. But I was like, I could spend 5 hours getting this correct in perspective, or use this public domain image and just do that. Which I'm not a huge fan of, but it's kind of a joke page. So I don't know. I'm kind of in that gray area. So
yeah.
Anyway.
No, I like it. I like that you're sharing too. I think that's cool. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, so I think we have some cool stuff to look forward to. Just one thing before we get into this topic, something that kind of came to mind when I finished this last page is I might actually make it a print when it's scanned and cleaned up a little bit. And I've been thinking about making a couple prints of some of the kind of covers and stuff like that, and just starting to kind of seed them into my store and stuff, just to like have those prepped and ready for conventions, but also to just kind of give people the option, because I think somebody had mentioned on Instagram really wanting a print of this page, and I was like, oh, I guess this would actually make a pretty cool like poster.
It would.
So yeah, so I think I might do that.
And the cool thing about it is because of the size that you draw it at, the sky's the limit as far as like, what size you want to print it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We had Peter Samedi from Alterna on Artcasters a couple days ago, and he was talking about newsprint and stuff like that, and it reminded me that at one point I was thinking about serializing this on actual newspapers.
Oh, yeah.
Like full out newspapers, like that style, that size. So that's still kind of an option on the table when it comes to print time. I think the way I'm envisioning the final book is more like probably 8.5 by 11.
Yeah.
But But I mean, the neat thing is because of that scale, yeah, I mean, that could be an option. Like I could actually do it as like a traditional Sunday comic, maybe even do a limited run like that or something.
Yeah, that'd be really
Um,
cool.
I'm excited to see this thing come to fruition because to me, it's like your concept is so good, and it's fun to see the. I like seeing early stages like that,
Yeah.
and I think that'll be really exciting. So, okay, so topic, I was thinking maybe we could tackle one of Marshall's questions. He asked quite a few, and I think maybe some of them we might have to, you know, bring for another date. But so Marshall of Donkey Jaw Projects had mentioned he's a really cool illustrator, good guy, friend of the show, friend I think of the hundreds community.
Yeah.
Um, and he said, I'd love to hear you guys tell a story of what it was like the first time you went into a comic book shop. And so and then there's a couple other questions after that, but I thought that would be a good question to answer. So you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in a really small town in California, Paso Robles. It's about maybe 30,000 people, but unlike kind of Northern California and Southern California, I'm in the Central Coast. So the towns like start and stop, not like down in LA where every town bleeds into every other town. Like there's actually, you can actually leave the town and not be anywhere. Like the next town is like 20 miles down the road. The next town past that's like 35. And there was no comic shop in my town or in the next towns over in either direction. So you actually had to go 35 miles down the road. And so as a kid, that was just like an impossible trip. Like that never happened, right? And so,
Yeah.
because there's also this hill called the grade, and it's like a 6% grade for like, I don't know, 10 miles or something. So it's actually pretty hard on the cars. It's not like, it seems like 30 miles isn't that big of a deal, and now it's not. But back then it was like the cars that I owned as a teenager, like almost couldn't make it on the grade, and I broke down multiple times and got stuck on the side of the freeway. Anyway, so but we went, and this is pre-internet, right? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
internet was around, but it was, I remember my cousin and I got, we found this page where people were selling used stuff, and I still remember the address. It was http://cayman.pages.com/ebay.htm. And it was the precursor to eBay owning their own domain. So that's the time in the internet it was. And so like I remember we drove to San Luis one time, like a couple of my buddies. I borrowed my mom's van, and we found a payphone because that's where the phone books are. And in because the phone books in my town didn't have listings for this other town, and so we had to drive there. And then I looked up and we started guessing what a comic book store might be listed under, because we had heard that there was one, but we didn't know where it was. And it was called Captain Nemo's Comics. It was really hard to find. Also, we didn't know our way around, and there's no like GPS or anything. So we eventually found it literally by, we went to a gas station and bought like a $6 map, right? And so we're like, and this is like a seaside town, so it's not like laid out like the Mormons lay things out in the middle of the desert where everything's a nice grid, you know, like in New York and stuff. It's like, it is winding roads that spider. Anyway, we finally found it. I didn't know what this term meant at the time, but I learned pretty quickly. It was a head shop. And so it was like, there was like tobacco pipes. There was an entire wall of this like basement store, and there's black lights everywhere with like, you know, weird glowing doors, posters, and there's like a curtain that was supposed to be shut that was open with all kinds of weird stuff kind of in this makeshift loft area in the top, full of like bean bags and like blacked out windows, and then in the corner on the other half of the store they had like action figures and long boxes full of comics. And it was the weirdest store. Eventually, I think by the time I was a senior in high school, they split the head shop off and the comic shop into two shops. The same guy owned it, but noticed that his clientele was fractured a bit. Anyway, so that was my experience, and I found the first miniseries of Deadpool. So not the first appearance, but the one where Liefeld's drawing him and he's working for Mr. Tolliver, and like Mr. Tolliver was like this big thing at the time. He was like in a bunch of books, and nobody knew who he was. He was the super mysterious character, and then I think creative teams changed and they all dropped that. But I bought the first for Deadpool, and all of my friends, I got them all into Deadpool, and then I started hunting down his first appearance, and I found it for $12 at that shop, New Mutants number 98, and I didn't have $12 at the time. And now every time any new trailer or announcement comes out about the movies, like that issue goes from like $300 to like $500 for like a week, and then it drops down to like $300. Anyway, but I never owned it or read it. I still haven't read it to this day. I should probably just buy it on Comixology. Yeah, so that was my long rambling thing. But it's like these...
No, I love it.
Yeah, it's like these creepy, like, drug-dealing stoner 20-year-olds that were, like, behind the counter. There's always, we're like these, like, kind of, 15, 16-year-olds. And I got the impression they were always making fun of us. Because, we weren't there for the cool stuff. We were there for the toys and the comic books, not the drugs and the porn. So anyway,
I love it.
Awesome. What was your first shop?
Okay, so I grew up in a small town as well, but I guess unlike the one you're describing, like it's actually where I live now. But I didn't live here for a very long time. Like I lived in Long Beach, all sorts of other locations, but grew up in the Antelope Valley, and everything's built on a grid. So it's like, everything from Division Street on is like either numbered by numbers, or if it's going the other way on the grid, it's by letters of the alphabet. So it's like super easy to find your way around, and it's really hard to get lost, because if you're on like L10 or 10th East and L, then your cross street, and you know how to get to 10th West,
right? And
I, because it's in relation to each other. So it's a very bikeable city, and so it's not bike friendly in the sense that it's like this giant. It is a giant hot desert, so it's like. But for me, growing up, like I just didn't think it was a big deal to kind of bike places, and this equally was a time where I knew the internet existed, but this was like we didn't have a computer in the house. I don't think my family even got really like a computer until high school. Until I was like a senior in high school, we got like a used Apple from like a friend, and then I don't think I owned my own computer for like a couple years after that, which is just weird to envision now. Right. But so there was this time when like very much like you're describing, like you just kind of find things by the phone book, and I had gotten hooked on comics, and we can get into how that happened outside of the comic book shops, and I really wanted to find out more about Spider-Man, because I had read some Spider-Man and gotten hooked, and then kind of picked up a couple issues on the spinner racks. And so I looked up, and I found out that we had like 3 local comic shops within like 10 or 15 miles or something.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I biked. And my first experience So there was this comic book shop, and it's not a comic book shop anymore. It still exists as a store, but now it's like a coin collecting shop. It's a very strange, kind of weird shop that I have a suspicion is like being used to just launder money. Because I don't know if there's that many coin collectors, but boy, they seem to be open all the time.
Do they sell like doubloons as well?
I don't know. I mean, it's just a coin collecting shop.
Because
It might sell doubloons.
a lot of the coin collecting shops also deal in precious metals, and so you would think that there's not a lot of traffic or business for that, but then it's because you don't know any doomsday preppers who are like hoarding precious metals and cans of wheat and ammunition in their basement.
You know what? Thinking about it, like that is a large contingent of people who live in the Antelope Valley. So so I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe that is. I mean, that's changing a little bit, but that contingent's still here.
Right.
So I can see that. That actually makes sense. But anyhow, so it was called a PNS, like N as in Nancy S, coins and comics, and I went there and they had this whole rack of comics, and in this day and era, like for someone like me who had never really stepped foot in a comic shop, this is like 5th grade. It was just mystifying because I was used to having to kind of like rifle through spinner racks and kind of hope they might have an issue that I find interesting. And here they had all the issues, and they had these long boxes with back issues.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so I remember really wanting to get an entry point to Spider-Man and looking at like Amazing Spider-Man and being like, oh, they're already an issue. At that time, it was like on issue 100 and something.
Yeah.
And then there were a couple others. Like I think there was a Spider-Man self-titled that had just launched, and then there was Web of Spider-Man, and I liked Web of Spider-Man. I was just drawn to it because they had the black costume.
Yeah.
And when I dipped into it, it was still in that storyline. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to pick up some of these issues. So I picked collecting the least profitable of the Spider-Man series. I haven't looked at the value of this, but I have like probably the first like 70 issues, like no gaps.
Oh, wow. But black suit, isn't that McFarlane? Todd McFarlane?
Well, I think that McFarlane did the run because keep in mind there were like 4 Spider-Man titles, right. And I think he did a couple of the interiors. I think most of it was done by what's his name, Junior?
Not Buscemi.
John Romita Jr.
John Romita, yeah.
I think he was handling most of it, and I think McFarlane was on just Spider-Man, and then working on Amazing. So like a lot of those McFarlane covers weren't Web of, they were like Amazing Spider-Man or they were Spider-Man. But anyhow, like, so I remember just being stoked and just getting, the most current issue. And I think it was like a fight with the Green Goblin that was kind of mid-fight, and then kind of having to go back like a day later to get, well, what happened before this, like, fight? Like, how did this thing start? And then just getting really quickly hooked, and then just kind of working my way backwards, trying to find the back issues. And this is, kind of like right, I guess probably like a little bit before the Image boom or at the very beginning of Image.
Yeah.
So like there wasn't the massive collectability. I mean, like some back issues were more expensive, but it wasn't like I got #1, which was like the most valuable, and I didn't get it to collect it. I got it to read it.
Right.
And so I opened it up because I didn't have access online to like read the first issue or anything like that.
Well, that's like everybody I knew back then had Spawn #1. It wasn't that big of a deal. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Image was new, and everybody was like, "Oh, cool! I'm gonna get Youngblood and Spawn and all that." And
it,
nobody was trying to keep them nice.
Yeah, and for me, like, so that was a go-to comic shop for a while, and then I found one that was even more local during the Image boom, a little bit later, called Bases, that was actually bikeable, and they still exist in the Antelope Valley. Bases Cards and Comics, and that place I religiously went to every Wednesday after school. I'd even go on days that weren't Wednesdays, and I'd even volunteer most days for about an hour after school, just helping them stock the long boxes for about an hour because they let me have a free comic.
That's awesome.
So I'd just come in and like loiter in their store and stock comics so that I could get a free comic because even a couple bucks at the time was like tough to do. But yeah, it was interesting because I do remember, especially that first comic shop. This was an era in time where it really felt like a Simpsons episode. Like you walked in and there was a guy who was like, "So you wish to learn of Spider-Man?" And, was kind of snarky about it.
Right.
And, to like a fifth grader, like, "Oh, you will, if you want to know the Black costume, you need to dig into these issues, but you wouldn't really have time for that since you're not into comics." And it's like a fifth grader,
Yeah.
So anyhow, it's a fun thing to think about because to me, I always remember that when people are saying that comics haven't made progress or that like the comics industry is dying or something like that, like there are always dire issues in comics and definitely some things to be concerned about, maybe with like the way that comics are being marketed, or like maybe the big two aren't always like writing the best stories or whatever. But the thing that I always just cling to is the fact that like Comic-Con International is a perfect example of like how far comics have gone.
Right.
Where it literally at this time it was a musky store with no space to walk through.
Yeah.
With kind of elitist gatekeepers, that were sort of just. I mean, I guess the best I can say is like they were sort of just gatekeepers who like kind of wouldn't let you in on comics. You had to kind of show up like every week and eventually earn the trust of the comic store owner. And at that point, you'd be kind of let into the comics thing and be able to kind of make your own choices. It was kind of like going to a record store, back in the day.
Yeah.
Except like the guys that frequented it were like fifth graders and got like giant like adults in sweatpants, or like you were talking about, kind of like a more seedy kind of underground kind of comic store. But you didn't have like what I see now whenever I go to a comic shop, like where it's like a mom and dad and their kids and they're walking around the store, and maybe an attractive young lady or like a normal looking person.
Yeah.
There's a massive amount of people that are into comics that just never really were engaged before. And so I know maybe sales numbers at the time were higher, but it to me it is encouraging. Like to me, even Comic-Con being such a kind of phenomenon where like everyone cosplays and does this stuff. And yeah. I remember the first time going to Comic-Con, that big contrast. Anyhow, I'm rambling, but
no, it's interesting.
The point being,
in the shop I was in, there was all kinds of different people, but no parents.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting. But I mean, it was because it was not a specialty shop. It was very specialty shop, but not just comics. There was a lot of other things as well. So.
It had something that's never really had marketing issues.
Right.
But yeah, like, so I guess what I'm getting at is just like, it's really cool to see how far things have come. However, I will say also, like, that comic shop that's still around here, definitely like comics aren't their main game. I think it's become more of a baseball card type of thing and a playing card kind of thing. But I do remember an era when, like, during the image boom, when like there were comic shops just opening like almost every other week.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's a really great question. It's fun to think back on. It's fun to think back on just the anticipation of biking, and before you went, like, kind of planning out which issues you wanted to look through and rifling through like long boxes to like find gems or find like special crossovers and stuff. And it's fun to it's just fun to kind of open that can of worms. So thanks for the question,
Yeah,
Marshall. That was really good.
that's a great question. So if anybody watching has other questions or topic suggestions that we can talk about, we would love them, because that was really fun, and I probably never would have thought to talk about that, because I'm usually more like topic specific rather than like tell a cool story about whatever. So that was awesome. It's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Muhammad in the chat is asking. He said, "I'm between two professions. So what shall I develop? What shall I do to develop and grow up my creativity?" And I think we could probably both answer that. Let's just take a minute or two,
Yeah.
and do that. We can dive in deeper, because that's a really good topic.
Yeah.
I would say I'm gonna put the timer up, so we'll just take 30 seconds apiece.
Love it.
I would say it depends on what you want to do, but no matter what it is, I would build a project around it, and a project that you have public accountability for, so that you're sharing it on Instagram or whatever. So state your thing, set some goals. A really good one is to do like a sticker stint, like I did. And if you want to look at my YouTube channel, I've got that. Or 100 Days of Comics, where you do comics, or 100 Days of something where you're like, I'm gonna animate, or I'm gonna learn to write, or NaNoWriMo. Like, there's a lot of those kind of challenges, and the need to move forward really quickly and really fastly, will often drive the ideas, because if you're waiting for creativity to happen, it's not going to happen. But if you sit there and you say, okay, what I'm going to do is I need to do this thing, and your brain always knows that when you're done with work, or when you're done with eating, or whatever, that you need to finish that before you go to bed. It's going to work on that all the time, and that's what will kind of drive creativity. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah. I totally agree, and I would just tack on the fact that like one of the things that prevented me for a really long time from kind of actually making comics, and to me that's the creative endeavor I want to be doing the most, was just this like fear of perfection. And at the end of the day, kind of like I was in love with the idea of doing it, but I wasn't really prepped or ready to do the work. And so I would just recommend set clear objectives, like Cory's talking about, with like a attainable goal, and not an easy one that you can just phone in. Like I'm good at drawing eyes, so I'm just going to draw eyes because that's what I'm good at. No, like,
Yeah.
Set goals that will expand what you're taking on, and then in taking on those goals, at the same time, like, understand like it's work, and if it's not work when you're doing it, that doesn't mean it can't be fun work, but the point being it's going to be work, and if it's not work, you're probably not stretching yourself creatively. So we're talking about development here, developing creativity. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions, sorry, I'm going over, but I think one of the biggest misconceptions about creativity, you can see any day by just walking through any work environment. You could go to the least creative work environment in the world, and everyone thinks they're creative. And I think everybody's capable of creativity,
Right.
But the part that most people miss about creativity is that big giant gap between your idea and execution and actually doing it, because like it's one thing to kind of be like, oh, I have these great ideas. Well, welcome to the world. Like, everyone has a lot of great ideas.
Yeah.
Being creative really is just an exercise in problem solving, and so pointing out the problems is not necessarily creative. That's just being a person with eyes and ears and a mouth. But with being creative, basically the main thing is just like the work. Like, do the work, show up. Like Cory was saying, set clear objectives, have some social accountability to it. Start a 48-hour art check.
Yeah.
Let us know when you do that.
Yeah. And the 48-hour art check is a great idea, because you find a buddy or somebody else who's either at a similar level to you, and you want to go on the journey together, or they're not as far, or they're further, and those are all different relationships, but they're all super beneficial. But the cool thing about it is it keeps you accountable to continue to do something all the time. And the reason that that's important is because of what Josh was talking about. The execution of something is actually where you find out whether you had a good idea or not. Because a lot of the time, I'll tell you this, your brain does this all the time. Your brain glosses over major things. Because if it didn't, you wouldn't be able to function, right? It's not like you see a library and you know the title of every book on the shelf, right? Your brain sees that and says, there are books there. And it glosses over everything unless something jumps out. And it does that because otherwise you wouldn't be able to like process the world around you. It also does that with ideas. And so when you're dreaming, it's not weird during the dream to be like, well, I'm going to open my closet and all of a sudden I'm flying. You know, that's not, it doesn't feel strange, but then you try to tell somebody the next day and they're like, how did you get to Paris from California? Yeah. And you're like, I don't know, I just walked outside and it was Paris, right? But and that's the same thing with having ideas, is you think that you have this fully formed idea, right? You're like, oh, I've got this great idea, right? But actually in the execution of it is when you realize that your brain was making you feel like you had that fully formed idea, but it was just like an idea in embryo, and the work is actually what fleshes out all of the blind spots and all of the problems, and you encounter like, oh, I don't know. Like you think, I've got this great idea for a movie, but until you like plot it out, you might not have any idea how to solve that problem or how that character does that thing or whatever.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd say too is when you're jumping into that endeavor too, it's important to kind of be brave. And I know that sounds loaded, but I think that's pretty true, because it's a scary and vulnerable thing when you start getting into the act of being creative. And when I say act, I mean it, because I think it's an action. Yeah. It's not like a passive thing. Being creative, it's an action. You're making stuff, and so the key is once you start doing that, you risk the fact that like what Cory was just talking about, like the reality versus the dream. So the dream is like, you know, where the logic can be anything, it can kind of work itself out, and then the reality is like when you see your stuff on the page. You know, it's a little scary and it's a little disappointing at first. And I think that's why a lot of people give up drawing. If drawing weren't hard, everyone would stick with it when it gets past the symbolic. You know, because Cory and I, actually Cory, topic for another time that we should write on our list would be symbols. And the education system pushing drawing in symbols versus drawing by seeing. Yeah, and I think it's a huge mistake where they're teaching kids like draw a triangle and a box and that's a house. Stuff like that is not a house. It doesn't look like a house. It's not how you draw a house. And by reinforcing that, you're teaching people to make icons, but not observe and not draw. And to me, I think that's a real shame, because like when I see like my son draw, he naturally is starting to, I mean, he draws simplistically, but there are times where he's scribbling something to figure it out. Right. And that's actually a little more accurate than like drawing a star by doing like the little, you know, the easy star shape and stuff. So I think and
that might be really an interesting thing, because the way that your son is wired, because there's a lot of studies that show that the symbol system is kind of a natural way of thinking, and a lot of art training starts by trying to break the symbol system. But I've had some students where I have they'll be on the spectrum. I had one student who had Asperger's. And we were doing an observational thing, and all of my students who had no art training really struggled with it, because the symbol system was so ingrained in their upbringing and everything, and in the education system. But he was able to look at this thing, and I said, so how is this project? And he said, it was my favorite project. And I said, why is that? And he said, because it was so easy. It looked amazing. It looked photorealistic. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, when I saw a shape, I just drew that shape. And when I saw a line, I just drew that line. And he had, because of the way he was wired, a much easier time with observational drawing, much more difficult time with more of the non-linear thinking, like when we got to gig posters and stuff and started trying to do metaphor, he struggled. But that observational thing he did so well. And the rest of the students really struggled with that because they had to first deprogram the way that they're... And anyway, it was one of those things. It was one of those things that kind of was a lesson reminder to me that there's not like a good or a bad. There's just a different, and there are definitely huge benefits to different people thinking differently. And in that instance, that what a lot of people might call a disability was a huge benefit to that guy in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, like, this is a suspicion of mine, but I feel like my generation, like, they didn't really have like the spectrum or anything like that. But most people I know of my generation that do cartooning have something off.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same for animation because it requires so much repetition and kind of dedication and a lot of alone time.
Yeah.
And a lot of those things aren't necessarily natural to like our species as like we're people who like to be in tribes and in groups and in community.
Right.
And the act of cartooning is kind of it's like the exact opposite of our instincts, where it's like, you're not going to be in community, you're not going to get instant fulfillment, you're not going to necessarily go on a hunt and get those endorphin rushes while you're doing it, because there's not a lot of endorphin rushes while drawing, like laboring over a comic and drawing the same background the fifth time, or the same character with like their head tilted like a little bit further than they were. So I do think there's definitely a lot more of that, I think, in my generation of cartoonists than I think people are aware of. Like I don't even doubt it with myself. I definitely I agree. I'm curious about that. We went off on kind of a tangent there, but what a great man. We're getting great questions. So like, I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. And I want to encourage people, like, first off, like Marshall asked such a good question. I kind of want to ask you guys out there, Muhammad, you in the live chat, for those of you who are watching it a little bit later, just in the comments section, let us know, like, what was your first experience in a comic shop, because it was such, like, honestly, it was really a cool thing to hear. Like, Cory, I had no idea about the kind of seedy head shop comic shop. Kind of makes comics seem like real, like, dark and seedy and rock and rolly.
Yeah.
And that makes me kind of excited about comics. And
that shop is still around. I tried to go the last time I was down there, but I couldn't. But at the end of the year, when I go home again to visit my parents, I'll do a little video. We'll go visit my old haunt.
Yeah, you totally should.
Yeah, that'd be cool. But yeah, let us know what your first experience with is a comic shop, and if it's too long of an answer to type, do a video and just tell the story, and just do hashtag my first comic shop. And then come and post that link to this video so that we can watch them, because I think that'd be kind of super fun to, like, just look at because everybody's is different, and I think that'd be awesome.
Well, sure.
That'd be super cool.
And then actually also Muhammad's question is great too. Like, what do you guys do to develop your creativity? Let us know too. All right, so that was a really good episode. It's cool. I appreciate the community and stuff. It's fun when you guys engage with us, because to me, it actually, like, I wouldn't have thought to ask either of those questions. And so, and they're great questions. Like, Cory and I are going to have trouble wrapping this up because of it, because they're so good. It's like, wow, what a fun conversation. Yeah. All right, so should we wrap it up?
Yeah, let's do it. So if you want to see Josh's stuff and soon order that giant awesome poster of little Josh drawing all those comics, go to quarterlystories.com. Check out my stuff. Go to corykerr.com. And if you want to follow along with this big, huge, month-long project that I'll be working on, you can check me out on Twitter and Instagram because I'll be posting it there, as well as here, and you're on my channel. So if you haven't subscribed, subscribe, hit that bell so you get notified when we go live. Make sure to subscribe to Josh's channel as well. Special thanks to No Saboteurs, Josh's band, for licensing the intro music. And we'll see you guys in a couple days. We're out.
Bye.